I have another study here, particularly relevant, I guess, to the way that you and I eat and many of the listeners. So this came out probably only a couple of weeks ago, and it was a study from Coimbra et al. Plant-based diets benefit aerobic performance and do not compromise strength, power, performance, a systematic review and meta-analysis. Really interesting. Meta-analysis. They were reviewing the body of literature that already exists. So studies that have looked at how does shifting to a plant-based dietary pattern affect physical performance, and they were looking at different aspects of physical performance. So aerobic performance, strength, and power. And they had 4 studies included in this that were looking at aerobic performance, and then 6 studies that were looking at strength and power. They found that the plant-based diets actually had a moderate but positive effect on aerobic performance. Mm-hmm. And there are some mechanisms that might explain that we can discuss.
Yeah.
And then there was no significant difference between the plant-based diets and control diets, omnivorous diets, for strength and power performance.
Right. Given the same stimulus, assuming
which I think is a positive, because a number of people
Sure.
would think that adopting a plant-based diet, one of the downsides might be that you're giving up some of your strength or power performance, or that you'll see a decline.
Right.
So the fact that there was no significant difference, I actually think that's a win
for sure
for plant-based.
And I think people have the assumption that it's a trade-off. It's like, I'm going to trade off my strength and power for my endurance. Not necessarily true.
Right.
And I think that by now, I mean, I know this is a pretty weak anecdote, but you can really just honestly look around and see how many thousands of people are eating a plant-based diet and are doing just fine. Like, you don't waste away and you're not all of a sudden weak. But if you don't do it properly, you probably will have a little bit of a decrease initially.
I wanted to chat about that because I think there are some areas that you need to focus on.
Yes, I think so too.
But just before that, the increase in aerobic performance.
Yeah.
I think anecdotally, there's enough success stories out there to know that something's going on. You see athletes towards the end of their career start migrating to plant-based diets. You see a lot of endurance athletes talking about how much better they're recovering, for example.
Some of the best ultra endurance athletes of all time were fully vegan. Yeah.
And it's not fully understood, but there are some mechanisms that might explain that, and some of them are quite obvious. So increased consumption of antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds that could assist with recovery.
Sure.
Increased consumption of polyphenols and nitrates, which could help increase or improve blood flow and the delivery of oxygen to muscles, and also the clearance of metabolic byproducts that accumulate during exercise. And then a really obvious one is higher glycogen.
I was going to say
storage.
A higher carbohydrate intake.
Yeah.
Yeah, that to me is probably the most obvious, because I've heard, again, this is anecdotal, lots of MMA fighters and CrossFit athletes, do you remember like years ago, the craze was the zone diet, and it was a very low carb diet for these CrossFit athletes, and it was super popular. Everyone was on pretty much...
It was like an Atkins style diet.
Yes. I think they were eating up to 150 grams of carbs a day. And we're talking about athletes who are performing monster volumes over the week and huge workouts. And the popularity of that low carb diet within that community took a bit of a knock because people weren't performing as well as they were before. And then all of these great athletes would come out and say, I upped my carbs from 150 to 650 and my performance is through the roof. Now, is it the plants, is it the polyphenols, or is it just literally having more glycogen, replenishing your stores, better energy availability? I would say it's probably a lot of it is the carbohydrate intake. These CrossFit athletes are a good window into elite physiology, and if they're only eating 150 grams of carbs a day, that's pretty low for that kind of volume. So upping your carbs is a no-brainer. But then you also hear, just to play devil's advocate, you hear the flip side of the coin, which is low-carb endurance athletes who reckon their performance has never been better on a ketogenic style diet, right? So you're going to find cases where both can work for sure. Like they're training low, but then they race high. I don't know.
I can't see how racing with depleted glycogen could be beneficial.
They don't actually say that they're depleted in glycogen when they're racing, though.
But I think if you're consuming a very low carbohydrate diet, you're not going to have full glycogen stores.
I thought that too. And there was a study. I wish I had it with me. I did not plan on talking about this, so I don't have the reference. But I'll dig it up.
We can come back to it.
Okay, we'll come back to it. There was a study by a very popular low carb advocate, a scientist. Yeah, it was Volek. I'm pretty
Jeff
sure.
Volek.
Jeff Volek.
Yeah.
He presented a study. I don't know if it was his study or one that he leans on heavily, but it was essentially answering that question: are people who are low carb glycogen depleted when they perform and go into race day? And what he was showing was that when you look at the muscles of these people who are on a very low carb, often ketogenic diet, their glycogen replenishment is actually pretty good.
Yeah, I thought this is bringing back some memories. I think
we
might have spoken about this off
years
air
ago.
Because I thought, is it Sarah Burke?
You're right.
I thought she did a review on this. We definitely need to come back to this in another episode. But I thought she did a review that was suggesting that was an outlier. That study of Jeff Volek's.
Probably right. No, we did speak about this. Did we speak about it with Rooney? It might have been with Rooney.
Yeah.
Yes. No,
but it could have been off air.
I think it might have been off air. But anyway, this is something I find it interesting. So there are people who will say that even if you're low carb, you can still replenish your glycogen. It's just the body does it in a different way. And I went to a conference and he was talking, and I took the mic and asked a question at the end. I said, is it that the liver, through gluconeogenesis, is providing glucose systemically and the muscles are taking it up and replenishing glycogen, right? So they're not eating carbs, but somehow after this long endurance event, they're, the next day, 24, 48 hours later, even on a low carb diet, they seem to have pretty much fully replenished glycogen stores. And so my, obviously, surface level understanding was that, well, they're coming from somewhere.
Has to come from somewhere. It must be
not eating it. Yeah. So I thought the liver would. But then what I thought was, again, don't know, I'm not a professor, is it that the liver is converting other nutrients into glucose? Could be amino acids or muscle tissue, could be fat, turning it into glucose, goes into the system, muscles soak it up, store it as glycogen. He said no. He said that doesn't
So where does he think it's coming from?
I don't know. He didn't get an answer.
Okay.
So this is our homework. Yeah, let's look into this.
My hypothesis would be that, yes, they would have some glycogen in muscle tissue, but I don't think it would be completely full.
No, I agree.
I think it's below their capacity.
And there's some pretty good sports science showing that you get super compensation of your glycogen stores if you consume your carbohydrates immediately after, right? So you can fit more in quicker if you go straight
the
after.
muscle's like a sponge.
It's a sponge. It's ready. If you don't do it like that way, then you've got an insulin-sensitive muscle for hours and hours after, 16 to 48 hours later. So it doesn't, as long as you're not trying to perform again on the same day, it actually doesn't matter how quickly you replenish your glycogen stores. You just got to have them replenished by the next workout. That's the main thing.
Quick one, folks. I get asked all the time about buying supplements and getting blood tests. The good news is I've created comprehensive and completely free guides for both. Simply head over to my website, theproof.com, to download them. That's theproof.com. Okay, let's get back to the episode.
You mentioned that there are some things that can go wrong. So I think quickly we can just reel off what some of those might be. So that meta-analysis found there was no significant differences between a plant-based diet and omnivorous diets for strength and power, which, as I said, I think is a win for plant-based diets because it's generally kind of assumed that you're going to have reductions in strength or power. People would attribute that to less protein or less bioavailable protein, things like that. And then in that study, they found a modest improvement in aerobic performance with the plant-based diet. Where could a plant-based diet potentially go wrong, or what should people focus on? If someone's listening and thinking, okay, that's great, that's really comforting, I want to start to make some changes here. What are some of the potential nutrients of focus or blind spots? I think total energy is one.
That for me was going to be the first off the bat. That's what I did wrong. I was in such a deficit accidentally. This is what happens when you eat a whole food plant-based diet: is your caloric density goes down, and this is the thing. Any diet, when you're in a deficit, especially 300 plus calories a day deficit, I don't care if you're eating only meat. When you lose that much weight, you start to get a little bit weaker.
You get weaker, you get tired,
sluggish,
fatigue. I mean, your testosterone will go down a little bit.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's not the plants, it's the deficit. So knowing what is your maintenance of calories that you need to try hit and how to get them is very
How
important.
did you navigate that in terms of finding ways to consume more calories without being like crazy bloated?
Right. So I had to start to add more calorie dense foods to my smoothies. So like more seeds and nuts and peanut butter, and then I was putting a little bit more olive oil on my salads, and then a protein powder because I was trying to get all my protein from chickpeas and legumes. You know, I was bloated all the time.
Finding some low fiber, high protein options.
Yeah, which in the beginning I was like against because I was trying to stick to that label of whole food, plant-based, eat real food in its natural form, nothing processed. Like I was meticulous about that. I think that let me down.
Yeah, and that becomes more difficult if you have performance-related goals and you're someone who is highly active, so you eat a lot of calories.
Yeah.
Because then the absolute amount of fiber is really high.
Yeah.
And B, with those performance goals, if you're trying to target a high protein intake at 1.5, 1.6 grams per kilogram, that kind of ability to get all of those calories from whole foods and feel comfortable is much harder.
Especially early on when you first transition and your gut just it's just not equipped to handle that amount of fiber. That's what I did wrong. I went from eating no legumes for 7 years to eating cans per day, multiple cans. And I was in so much discomfort. And my digestion probably sucked as well, which is why I was losing weight.
Yeah, I used to think it was a problem to have kind of plant-based meat alternatives in the diet.
I'm okay with it.
I'm completely... I mean, I look at the nutrition label and I'm looking for ones that are not very high in saturated fat because you can find some and they just load it with coconut oil.
Right.
They taste great, but they might have 20 grams of saturated fat in a serve.
Yeah.
I literally saw
20 in a serve.
one product
Wow.
the other day. I won't name names. And I've had that product before and it does taste great, but I'm sure that's...
Is it mushroom based?
I
think I might know the one.
It's not Dr. Thomas Dayspring approved.
I think I might know the one.
Yeah, it's a great tasting product and I know why a lot of places are using it.
It's a mushroom.
It's very high in saturated fat.
Very, very meaty mushroom.
No clues. Anyway, that's like a sometimes food for me, rare occasions, if I want to indulge.
Sure, yeah.
I don't think it's poison. I don't think it's going to kill you. I just think if I was eating it every day, I would go and do my blood work.
Yeah.
And ApoB would be probably north of 120, 130.
Yeah.
And I'd rather it below 80.
Right.
I look at saturated fat. I look at the sodium content. That's the second one that I like to look at. Again, I think 300 to 400 milligrams of sodium in a serve is like, that's really good if you can find that.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of 500-600 milligrams is, in the middle of perhaps acceptable, particularly if you're not having it 3 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
But you might find some falafel, for example.
Do you know how thirsty I am the day after?
They might have
falafel?
1,400 or 1,500 milligrams of sodium
I'm not surprised.
in one serve. So you have to be really careful with some of those, particularly if you have high blood pressure.
Yeah.
Now, I don't have high blood pressure, but I still like to kind of choose the ones that are middle of the road, 500 milligrams of sodium or less. Saturated fat, I'm looking for 5 grams or less in a serve. Mm-hmm. But those plant-based meat alternatives that meet that criteria, because usually they are much lower in fiber and volume compared to if you were getting the same amount of protein from legumes.
Sure.
They're a nice addition within a diet that has legumes.
Yeah.
It's not that you're removing black beans and lentils. Like I eat heaps of those, and tempeh. But you can kind of supplement the diet with these plus or minus a protein isolate. Speaking of protein isolate, that one that we had at the retreat was really good.
Yeah, we should have brought it back.
Shout out to White Wolf.
White Wolf, they hooked us up.
They did.
We had
this is not
zero.
This is not a paid ad, but
zero protein deficiency on our retreats. I'll tell you what.
I've always used White Wolf for years now.
The flavor's great.
So, anyway, protein.
Yeah.
So total energy.
And sorry, just to go back on that. When you're eating those plant-based meats, do you care about this? Like, is it soy? Is it mycoprotein? Is it lupin? Do you look for that, or do you just look at macronutrients?
I don't care so much, other than I try and have variety, and diversity.
Yeah.
So I'm not just buying the exact same one every time and eating that 3 times a day.
Yeah.
I would like to have exposure to soy, to lupin,
seitan.
and I think that's the best bet.
Yeah.
Rather than kind of putting all your eggs into one basket.
Yeah.
And each of them have slightly different nutritional profiles and
Right.
different amounts of unsaturated fats, and some of them add certain micronutrients to them and some don't. I don't really get bogged down in that too much. I'm literally looking at saturated fat, sodium, the practical application. Does it have the texture I'm looking for, and does it taste good?
Yeah.
Do I enjoy it? Those are the kind of big things, and then I just mix it up. I find 3 or 4 or 5 of those that are kind of go-tos, and buy them and sort of integrate them on a weekly basis.
Right. And again, just going back to why we even started talking about that, if you're trying to eat that amount of protein, say 25 grams in chickpeas, I mean, that's got to be like 5 cans of chickpeas just to hit 25 grams, right? And if you've got resistance training goals, muscle building goals, I think there's more practical ways of hitting your protein requirements.
And a lot of people will, immediately, without even looking at the studies, just assume that these are really bad for your health.
Yeah, you hear that all the time.
Compared to meat. But there are studies that have looked at that.
Right.
And so I'm comfortable with them based on the nutritional profile. The fact that when you have them instead of a typical kind of equivalent meat product, you are exposing yourself to less saturated fat. You're still exposing yourself to a little bit more fiber because they do contain some fiber. Often they can have more potassium. And the studies that have looked at these, like the swap meat trial, you see improvements in blood lipids, and you don't see a deleterious effect on blood pressure, which people might assume because there is this idea out there that in order to make them taste good, you have to add tons of sodium. And there is a little bit more sodium in these products if you compare them to the meat alternative.
Sure.
But most people, when they're consuming their meat, add salt.
Exactly. Right.
So when you compare these foods as people would consume them, you don't see a significant difference in blood pressure.
And within the context of a very plant-heavy diet, there's evidence showing that the plants are protective, even if you're eating red meat, right?
Yeah.
To a certain degree. So why can't that same thing apply to a plant-based meat alternative in the context of a very plant-heavy diet with heaps of diversity? I don't see any reason why it's a problem, especially for long-term health.
I mean, all of this has to just be considered within the context of your biomarkers.
Yeah.
Where is your ApoB at? Where's your blood pressure at?
Right.
All these sorts of things. But I think they have their place in a healthy, plant-rich, plant-based dietary pattern, particularly for the athlete with a high energy requirement and a high protein requirement.
Yeah.
That wants to feel comfortable.
Sure. And this isn't even taking into account the social aspect of it being vegan or plant-based in a very carnivorous world. Like if you have an option that you can bring to the barbecue that's not meat and it tastes really good and it looks like meat and the same experience, that could be another great time to incorporate into your diet, just socially. Just takes the pressure off showing up to the party with a can of lentils.
Yeah, I think they've been unfairly demonized.
I think so. Yeah.
The other nutrients that would be good for an athlete, particularly an athlete that's doing a lot of endurance work, would be iron. So athletes in general have a higher iron requirement. You lose iron through sweat. There's inflammation associated with exercise.
You lose iron through sweat?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
And when you have more inflammation, the body requires more iron. There's obviously an inflammatory response to exercise. And then also what's interesting is actually the foot striking the ground.
Yes.
And the red blood cells that are flowing through the foot at that time can become damaged.
Yes, I've heard.
And that can actually cause a condition called runner's anemia.
Yeah.
Have you heard of that?
Yeah, the heel striking over
Foot strike hemolysis or something. Yeah. So if you're someone that has a lot of kind of heel striking, but it also can occur in resistance training, which is interesting. All of this can kind of coalesce to a higher requirement for iron.
Yep.
But you would go and get your iron tested.
Right.
And you look at serum ferritin. And if that's below 30 milligrams per liter, then that is kind of indicative of iron deficiency. And in that instance, if an athlete or anyone had less than 30 milligrams per deciliter, 30 milligrams per liter for serum ferritin, then that's when you would consider a supplement.
Okay.
It's like 40 to 60 milligrams of elementary iron.
Right. Would you say that iron supplementation, similar to creatine, is just a do no harm, may as well take it, or no?
I think you have to test first.
Okay.
Because here's the other thing. Elevations in serum ferritin can increase risk of certain chronic diseases.
Okay.
Cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. In fact, one of the papers I want to speak about is red meat and risk of type 2 diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the proposed mechanisms by which red meat might affect risk of type 2 diabetes is through the elevation of iron status from heme iron, which is rapidly absorbed.
Right.
Now, I think you wouldn't just go out and sort of prophylactically take an iron supplement, high dose.
Right.
I mean, if it's small, if it's like
a multi,
5
like
to
a
8
general
milligrams,
multi.
yeah, if it's in a multi,
that's okay.
I don't think that's a problem.
Right.
But that input amount is not going to take someone out from a deficiency to a normal optimal status.
Okay.
Right? These are two different things. If you're below 30 milligrams per deciliter, you need about 40 to 60 milligrams of elemental iron per day to kind of get you back into a healthy range for serum ferritin, which is iron storage. It's indicative of your iron stores.
Right.
And if you were to do that, then you would wait sort of 6 or 8 weeks at least.
Right.
You know, to retest, maybe a little bit longer, probably 3 or 4 months actually.
Right. Based on the red blood cell lifespan. Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
And that is a potential blind spot. And there are studies looking at VO2 max in athletes who have healthy serum ferritin versus suboptimal or iron deficiency. And VO2 max goes down if you have iron deficiency because iron plays an important role in the carriage of oxygen, supply of oxygen to muscles.
And most people, when they do a blood test, you're getting iron, ferritin. Like there's not just one thing you're looking at, right?
Yeah, you can. Serum iron. There's ferritin.
Right.
Transferrin saturation, all of these things. Then hemoglobin you're going to look at as well to see if it's iron deficiency with anemia or without anemia. Serum ferritin is where you would start.
Okay.
And then you would work with your physician or dietitian to kind of peel back the layers a little bit more. But generally speaking, if you're below 30 milligrams per liter for serum ferritin, that's when you would consider supplementation.
Okay.
There are also, certain things you want to rule out, like inflammatory conditions and whatnot, that I think people need to do on an individual basis with their physician. But once you've ruled out any type of inflammatory, like bowel disease, then you would look to, dietary modifications can be helpful. But often if serum ferritin is extremely low, it requires a supplement. Or an iron transfusion.
Yeah, I've been sort of following my ferritin levels over the years since being plant-based, and I think it has trended down a little bit. It's certainly not like I'm not anemic or anything, but I have noticed a downward trend, and I wonder, is it to the point where I need to start thinking about supplementing, or because I really don't think I can do any better with my diet currently. I think I eat a really, really responsible plant-based diet. I'm focusing on iron-rich foods.
Lots of legumes.
Lots of legumes. I'm trying to pair them with, enhancers of the absorption of them and all of that kind of stuff. If somebody's in that position, they feel like they're doing everything right, and they still have this sort of downward trend, not to the point of being like pathological by any means, but sort of heading in that direction maybe.
Keep an eye on it and see if you go below 30 milligrams per liter for serum ferritin, which would be indicative of a deficiency. But most of the literature suggests that while heme iron is more bioavailable, there isn't an increased incidence of iron deficiency in plant-based folks, not in Western countries, right? And there's a couple of kind of proposed explanations for this. One is that as the body has less iron available through the diet, it can increase the amount that's absorbed. So there's this like kind of compensatory effect. But I would say you should keep an eye
Yeah.
on serum ferritin.
Yeah.
And if it was to go below 30 milligrams per liter,
Yeah.
then you would want to consider a supplement.
Yeah.
And you would also want to keep an eye on hemoglobin as well.
Sure. What else? Yeah. What else do people should be focusing on if they go to this plant-based
B12
diet?
as well.
Yeah.
And that's also important for the supply of oxygen to muscle. DHA and EPA.
Mm.
We've spoken a lot about this.
Yep.
But I mean, there's emerging evidence that DHA and EPA could be playing an important role in the preservation of muscle tissue and actually the building of new muscle tissue. So increasing muscle protein synthesis, reducing muscle protein breakdown. So I think supplementing with an algae oil and trying to get in that 1 gram a day ballpark is probably sensible. I mean, we presented some research on the retreat looking at a much higher dose, 2 to 3 grams a day, that was able to kind of attenuate muscle loss in people that were sort of bedridden, which I think is an interesting area of research. Now, 2 to 3 grams per day of DHA and EPA is a lot. And you wouldn't want to do that if you had cardiovascular disease or atrial fibrillation, or you were at risk of bleeding.
Yep.
Then you would want to speak to your physician before having a high dose DHA, EPA fish oil or algae oil. And I don't think the average person needs to be thinking about 2 or 3 grams a day. Maybe if you're someone who is in your 50s or 60s and you're bedridden, like in those studies, and you need to do everything possible to protect the muscle, there's some evidence that could be helpful. From an athlete point of view, I think that 1 gram a day that Philip Calder said is probably sensible. Creatine, you mentioned.
Yep.
So lots of evidence that can be beneficial for muscle mass, so increasing lean mass, strength, which we've spoken about. And that for that outcome, it's 3 to 5 grams a day in that ballpark. And you can just start that 3 or 5 grams from day one, and by about a month in, your cells will be saturated.
Yeah.
So that's when you'll start to experience the full benefits of it.
Yeah.
Or you can do a loading phase of anywhere between 20 or 30 grams per day for like a week.
Right.
And then you will saturate the cells really quickly, and then you switch to that 3 or 5 grams a day.
And some people are non-responders and responders.
Yeah.
That I find really interesting. I feel a huge effect of creatine. I mean, in Bali, I was like begging you for some. Thankfully, you dropped some at my door. But like, I really respond well to it. I feel the difference physically. My performance in the gym is completely different. I absolutely love it and swear by it. But there's other people, I think Rooney even mentioned, he's a non-responder.
Yeah.
And he did a lab test to figure this out. They check biopsy of muscle. And despite going on a loading phase, it doesn't saturate in the muscle of some people. And I don't know why. I think there's probably a genetic element to that as well. But for those...
I'll ask Darren.
Yeah, ask Darren. That's a good one.
Add that to my list.
But I would be interested to see why some people respond so well to creatine and others don't at all. And I believe there was some research in creatine intake in people who are plant-based seeing more ergogenic effects than in people who aren't. I don't know why.
Yeah, and that makes sense because your body produces about 1 gram a day.
Yeah.
And the average omnivore will get 1 gram a day through their diet.
Yeah, right.
Whereas people consuming vegetarian or vegan diets are getting much less or zero.
Right. So you're making up for that slight little deficit there.
Yeah, so there might be about a gram a day difference in
which may be
intake.
Yeah, you might feel the difference with that. Who knows?
Right. That said, the kind of clinically effective dose, or where you see the maximum benefit, is at that 3 or 5 grams a day. So no matter if you're an omnivore or a vegetarian, you're likely to benefit from supplementation.
It's funny that creatine isn't prescribed on a per kilo basis, because like you're thinking about it, it's where is it going? Muscle tissue, right? Muscle cells, mostly.
It should be on a per kilogram of lean mass.
That's what I was thinking.
Basis.
Right. So you should sort of, if you want to, because for you to take a 3 to 5 gram dose and then somebody's grandma very different bodies, very different amount of muscle. You would think that the dose would be dependent on the lean mass, but
Well, to be fair, I think it's a translation of the science into a kind of more accessible format.
okay,
A lot of the studies do look at like 0.1 grams per kilogram
Right.
per day, or 0.13 or 0.14.
yeah,
And I think it just becomes more easy for people to kind of comprehend
right.
when you say, here's the grams
Yeah.
to take,
This
and
is
here's
the
a
serve.
range,
Yeah.
3 to 5. Most people probably fall between 3 and 5
Yeah,
when you calculate it out.
yeah, sure.
But if you're someone that has a really high lean body mass, a lot of muscle tissue, then you might want to be having a little bit more than that. And I guess the other thing to note here is there are studies looking at 20 to 30 grams a day and not seeing deleterious effects on kidney or liver function. And some of the studies looking at, bone we mentioned before, those are dosing at like 7 to 10 grams a day.
Yeah,
Some of the cognitive studies that are emerging are looking at 20 grams a day. So if you wanted to have 7, 10 grams a day to be on the safe side, if you had a lot of muscle mass, then I don't think that's a bad idea.
yeah.
The other one's taurine.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever supplemented with
I've
taurine?
never, no.
Either have I, but I'm considering
Really?
it. Yeah,
Okay.
it's a conditionally essential amino acid, and vegetarians tend to have lower levels
Okay.
of taurine.
And what is its role?
So there might be some upside here. It's been shown in clinical studies to improve strength and to reduce muscle damage after eccentric loading.
Okay.
It doesn't reduce inflammation, but it seems to somehow reduce muscle damage, right? Coupled with an improvement in strength. And in those studies, they were using 50 milligrams per kilogram per day.
Okay.
So for a 70 kilo person, that's about 3.5 grams of taurine,
Okay.
which is it's an amino acid.
Right.
Now, our body can make it, but it's considered conditionally essential. And as I said, vegetarians tend to have lower levels of this. So it might be something that, someone who's consuming a vegetarian or completely whole food plant-based diet might want to consider.
Right.
This is like if you're getting the towel and you're really
Squeezing out the last drop here. Yeah.
the last few drops.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think there's an issue with deficiency. Again, it's similar to creatine,
Yeah.
where we're talking more about optimization.
Yeah. So even if you don't take creatine in your plant-based, you're still most likely going to be pretty healthy and you're going to perform fine in the gym. We're just talking about that extra 1 to 2%, maybe 5%.
And the comforting thing is in these studies where they're comparing aerobic performance and strength and power, to my knowledge, these are not plant-based athletes that are supplementing with creatine and with taurine,
Right.
and they're not even necessarily people who are hyper focusing on iron and B12 and EPA and DHA and their total energy. So the fact that there is a modest improvement in aerobic performance and you're not seeing any differences in strength and power in a group of people that probably aren't even that dialed in, I think is really reassuring, because you may be able to get, there might be more benefits up for grabs that we can't see
Yeah, that's a good point.
by fine-tuning this further.
Very good point. And what's probably not spoken about enough, or maybe it is, but the focus seems to be on these nutrients and supplements, is the stimulus. What is the physical stimulus that you're putting on through your body every day? I don't care what diet you're on. If you're not doing the resistance training, you can eat all the protein in the world and you're not going to gain much muscle, right? If you're not doing the cardiovascular training, you're not going to improve your heart health. So got to get the stimulus right. And then on top of that, then you might find some benefits with these supplement protocols and dietary patterns. But you've got to get the stimulus in there. Not many people focus on that. They sort of look for the easier thing, which is what you're eating 3 times a day, rather than putting in the work.